Namaste. Welcome to Vayu Flute. This is episode 2 of the new series Bansuri Innovations. In the first episode, I laid out the reasons for starting this series. The main reason being that I would like to encourage the younger generation to be creative and think of ways of bringing new innovations to the Bansuri. There is always new room for improvement to any instrument. I also indicated that it is important to recognize and salute the past innovators. This is exactly what we're doing in this episode. So where do we start? Let us start from the very beginning. The flute is probably the first musical instrument of human civilization. Archaeological excavations in China and Central Europe have found elementary flutes made from bones almost 40,000 years ago. The flute has been an important musical instrument in practically every civilization of the world. The flutes of ancient civilizations have generally been of the end-blown types, such as the Peruvian from South America, quena here, end-blown because make a sound from the end of it. It is only in ancient India, in the Bharat civilization, that the transverse flute or side-blown flute that you see here first appears. Look at this fresco from the Ajanta caves. On the middle you see a woman playing such a transverse flute to a dancer. The Ajanta caves, as we know, is very, very old, several thousand years ago. We all know about Krishna and the magic he created with this flute. Krishna, of course, existed during the Mahabharata days, which most likely happened more than 5,000 years ago. The earliest text available that describes the flute is Bharata's Natya Shastra. This is the oldest surviving formal literature in Indian arts and dates back to more than 2,000 years ago. In it, there's a section that classifies all musical instruments into 4 different categories. The flute is, of course, included here because it was one of the more important instruments, even at that time. In the 2nd century Tamil literature, Silapadikaram, elaborate details are given, including precise dimensions and distances of tone holes in the construction of the flute, and also of various playing techniques. The 13th century Sangeeta Ratnakara gives 15 different types of flutes with different measurements, providing different shrutis. In addition, there is clear indication that flutists of that era were proficient in the technique of transposition. Transposition is where you shift the bass sa to different tone holes. This indicates a pretty high level of playing proficiency that existed even then. It was probably at this point that Hindustani and Carnatic music diverged, even in flute playing. In Hindustani music, the bass note sa is produced by closing the top 3 holes. In Carnatic music, the sa is produced by closing the top 2 holes. For 6 centuries after, there is little known about how the flute evolved in India, probably due to the foreign invasions and the turmoil that went along, especially in the north. We will now come to the modern era, starting in the late 1800s, and progress somewhat chronologically and alter between the north and south of India, as Hindustani and Carnatic classical music systems had evolved somewhat on different tracks by then. The first important flutist is Sharabha Shastri from Kumbakonam in Tamil Nadu. Shastri lost his eyesight and his father also at a very young age and became initiated into flute and a musical career at a very young age. He received training from teachers, one of them actually being a disciple of the legendary composer Tyagaraja. Shastri died unfortunately at the very young age of 32. But within his short lifetime, Shastri evolved his own fingering technique, is credited with having many compositions to his name. Until his time, the flute was essentially used in the concert stage as an accompaniment to dance. He alone is said to have brought it to the stage as the main concert instrument. Anecdotes from musicians who witnessed his playing suggest that he was something of a musical genius who made his audience spellbound. No recordings exist because he died before recording facilities were made available. The picture here shows a flute that belonged to Shastri, preserved by his descendants. You can see that it has 8 tone holes already. At some time in the past, Carnatic flute had only 7 tone holes, but an 8th was added some time before Shastri. Shastri had one important student who took over his mantle as the leading Carnatic flutist upon his death. That student was Palladam Sanjeeva Rao. From Shastri's death to the early 1930s, Palladam Sanjeeva Rao was the reigning monarch of Carnatic concert flute playing. Sanjeeva Rao had a very staccato-like approach to playing. His playing would be very brisk, making abundant use of tonguing and finger strokes. It is not clear whether this was the style he learned from his guru. Some old 78 RPM recordings of his playings are still available, and you're currently listening to a small clipping of one of them. Here he plays the ragam Kambodhi. Meanwhile, in the north, Hindustani classical music was about to adopt a new instrument. Pannalal Ghosh of Bengal was born to a musical family. His father was a sitarist. His younger brother, Nikhil Ghosh, a noted tabla player. As a child, Pannalal tried to play on the shorter flutes associated with folk music, what he had learned on the sitar from his father. At about age 11, he accidentally came across a longer flute. At that time, he was also apparently blessed by a sage who predicted that music would be his career. In his late teens, he learned martial arts and was involved in the independence movement. He was 18 by the time he started focusing his attention on the flute. It was then that he decided that a longer flute would more suit Hindustani classical music. He experimented with different lengths and material and finally settled on bamboo with a length of a little over 30 inches. This eventually became the standard for future concert Bansuri players. He was the one to introduce a 7th hole which would be placed off-center. Until then, the North Indian flute only had 6 holes. The 7th hole was placed off-center to enable his pinky to close it and produce Tivrama. He was blessed with long fingers. Reaching the Tivrama, that is the 7th hole, may not be possible for many flute players on the longer Bansuris. Nowadays, although concert flutists continue to use a 7-hole Bansuri, the last hole is usually left alone, and the Tivrama is produced from the pancham by tilting the flute inwards. He also invented a longer 42-inch flute with only 4 holes to play and explore the lower octave. Pannalal Ghosh was not only an innovator and a legendary classical musician. He was much involved in the film industry, where he has to his credit numerous compositions, including collaborations with Ustad Ali Akbar Khan and Pandit Ravi Shankar. Unfortunately, he died at the young age of 49. Had he lived longer, he would have blessed us more with his wonderful music and might even have incorporated more innovations from his innovative mind. One can say that it was due to Pannalal Ghosh's experimentations, innovations, that the Bansuri has become an important instrument in Hindustani classical music today. What you're watching here is a rare video clip taken from the internet. When Pannalal ji was 22 years old and was still preparing the long Bansuri for entry into Hindustani Sangeet, an event of seismic proportion with respect to the Carnatic flute world happened. A young boy, some 15 years younger than Pannalal Ghosh ji, came from the villages to give a flute recital in Chennai, or what was previously known as Madras, in 1933. The 7-year-old astonished everyone in the audience, which included many musicians. The young boy's name was T.R. Mahalingam, affectionately called Mali. What you're seeing here is a poster of that famous concert. The organizers, probably to attract maximum attention, touted the young boy as the avatar of the legendary flutist Sharabha Shastri, who died so young. What the knowledgeable audience witnessed at that performance, they never thought was possible in a flute, nor had they seen anyone so young with almost supernatural musical ability. Mali was able to produce all the intricate gamakams, or ornamentations, associated with vocal Carnatic music. The tonal quality he was able to produce was mesmerizing. In addition, he had an uncanny sense of rhythm. Just some 2 years before, recognizing the extraordinary musical talent in the 5-year-old, a couple of established senior vidwans, along with Mali's father, took the boy to Palladam Sanjeeva Rao. The boy would need training from the best flutist around, so they thought. Mali performed the difficult Bhairavi Varnam in front of the flute vidwan. In the middle of his playing, Sanjeeva Rao got up and abruptly went up to his bedroom and locked himself. What made Sanjeeva Rao do this? Perhaps he saw fearful visions of this young boy taking over his reign as the flute king. If so, his visions would prove extremely accurate. Sanjeeva Rao's refusal to teach Mali turned out to be a blessing in disguise. Mali had to teach himself and come up with his own techniques, which would eventually prove to be revolutionary and far superior. And that combined with an unmatched natural musical ability was a potent combination that would change the Carnatic flute tradition forever. In this clipping, Vidwan T.H. Shankaran, perhaps Mali's closest Sishya, is taking one line from a popular Tyagaraja Kriti to illustrate the difference in approach between Sanjeeva Rao and Mali.
மாலி சார் தான் இதெல்லாம் உங்களுக்கு இதுக்கு முன்னாடி இந்த ஃப்ளூட்டில் இந்த மாதிரி விஷயங்கள்லாம் ஒன்றும் இப்போ ஒரு கீர்த்தனை வச்சுக்கோ இப்படிதான் சஞ்சீவ் ராவ் வாசிப்போம். அப்புறம் அதை இப்படி கொண்டது சாமநாத பிள்ளை ட்ரைட், அவர் முயற்சி பண்ணார். பட் அவருக்கு இந்த சவுண்டு ஒன்றும் கிடைக்கல. ஆனால் அவரும் பெரிய ஒரு வித்வான் ஃப்ளூட் சாமநாத பிள்ளை. மாலி சார் அதை இவர் அச்சீவ் பண்ணார். இதுக்கு ஒரு கிஃப்ட், அது எதாவது நினைச்சவர்தான் பேசுவோம் கையில்.
Pannalal and Mali highlight two different forms of innovation. Pannalal brought a whole new instrument into classical music. Mali took an existing instrument and revolutionized the techniques of playing. Before Mali, flutists held the flute in a somewhat stiff manner. The fingers were straight and the tip of the fingers were used to close the tone holes. Rather like this. All the fingers were parallel to each other. Mali preferred what is known as a parrot clutch. This allowed his fingers to relax more. The more your fingers relax, the more you can do with them. That's a simple equation in flute playing. Mali also used more than one way of playing a particular note. This would give him added flexibility and variation in tonal quality. For example, the knee in Kalyani will normally be produced by half closing the third hole from the top, like this. He would also play the knee by opening the third hole completely but closing the top two holes and holes 4, 5, 6. This technique is known as cross-fingering, and Mali was the first to introduce this into classical music. He would use this technique in very fast phrases plus other techniques to provide different ways of playing each note to provide a variety of different tonal effects. He was also the first one to tilt the flute inwards or outwards to reach a lower or higher note. This would be particularly useful in connecting the ga or the ri to ma in ragams like Kannada or Kedaragaulam. Mali died at the age of 59. What you're seeing in the background is perhaps the only video recording available taken at his last public performance at the end of 1985. Video recordings were just coming into the scene and TV was still pretty new. This performance of Mali did not really highlight Mali at his best because he was quite ill while he was playing, and to top it all, he had a broken arm. In fact, he had to cancel this concert halfway through. Fortunately, there are many audio performances available that showcase his remarkable talents. Carnatic musicians unanimously agree that Mali was one of the greatest musical geniuses of the 20th century. He had a following in the north too. It is said that Pandit Ravi Shankar used to crave to listen to his music. When Mali went to Delhi in the early 60s to receive a presidential award, a young and upcoming Bansuri player came up to him and prostrated before him, seeking his blessings. That Bansuri player's name was Hariprasad Chaurasia. When a gifted musician introduces a new instrument, such as what Pannalal Ghosh did, the instrument often dies with the musician unless other talented musicians take it up. Fortunately for Hindustani classical music, many talented Bansuri players took up the mantle that Pannalal ji left behind, and none more so than Pandit Hariprasad Chaurasia. Whereas Mali seemed to have been born with a flute in his hand, it took some time for Hariprasad ji to bring out the latent musical talent in him. He started off as a wrestler of all things, because this is what his father wanted him to be. He started learning vocal music at the age of 15, but later switched to the Bansuri, receiving training from Bholonath Prasanna of Varanasi. He joined All India Radio at the age of 19. Later on, he wanted to learn from Annapurna Devi, the daughter of legendary Ustad Alauddin Khan, and also the first wife of Pandit Ravi Shankar. Annapurna Devi was a Sulbahar player, known for her purity and classicism. After her divorce from Ravi Shankar, she became somewhat a recluse and seldom appeared in public. She was, however, highly sought after as a teacher. When Hariprasad ji approached her, she agreed only if he would fulfill two conditions. You find often gurus and teachers, whether it be in the field of spirituality, science, or the arts, like to test the determination and passion of a potentially promising student by giving them seemingly impossible tests before accepting them as their students. First, she asked Hariprasad ji to unlearn everything he had learned so far. Then he had to switch from being a right-handed flute player to a left-handed flutist. Hariprasad ji duly complied. Hariprasad ji brought to the Bansuri another famous scholar, Gharana. His playing is characterized by exquisite touches, silky smooth transitions from one note to another, and just his sheer musical genius. The problem with listening to a lot of Mali or Hariprasad ji is that it becomes hard to listen to other flutists who just seem to pale in comparison. Both the North and South have seen changes, refinements since the days of Pannalal ji or Mali. In the North, many now use offset finger holes not being aligned in a straight line like this, to make it easier for fingers to reach. A few, such as the school to which Praveen Godkinde belongs, use a small upper thumb hole to reach the pancham. A few also use mechanisms to close the bottom pancham hole to reach the tivrama. Starting with Dr. N. Ramani, Carnatic flutists have progressively been using longer flutes and therefore lower shrutis. Mali mostly used a short G Carnatic tuned flute, which is probably necessary when stage equipment was primitive and one needed a penetrating sound to overcome a loud violin or mridangam. Although higher pitched flutes can be quite effective for short pieces and folk music, film music, etc., it is easier to go off pitch and quite energy sapping if you blow hard like Mali used to. Playing a whole concert with one of them requires extraordinary pitch and tonal sensitivity, which only Mali seemed capable of. Another development is that today's Carnatic flutists, such as Sashank or Jayant, also now commonly use longer Bansuri length flutes for lighter pieces and bhajans, a trend initiated by Dr. Ramani. A final word about innovations. One can bring about the greatest innovations in music, but there are two requirements to make these innovations widely accepted and long-lasting. First, the innovator must have exceptional musical ability to showcase the innovations or have some others with such ability to showcase for them. Second, these innovations must be taken up by a succeeding generation of talented musicians. Fortunately, both criteria were amply met for Pannalal ji as well as Mali ji. In Pannalal ji's case, since he died young, his concert career was relatively short, but this was made up by having many very talented musicians, many talented flutists take over where he left off. Although Mali's life also ended somewhat prematurely, he was recognized as a top musician from the early age of 7 and therefore had a long career, more than enough to create a lasting legacy. Now that we have given our pranams to the innovators of yesterday, we will explore ideas for new innovations. In the next episode, we will inquire whether there is any need for innovations or if the existing instruments are perfect enough. If there is no need, then this will be the end of the series. If there is a need, then the first step is to recognize what exactly are weaknesses of today's Bansuris. Thank you.